Okay, so we're going to take a look at Chapter 3, and I'm going to break this down into hopefully manageable chunks. But what we're going to take a look at in Chapter 3 are cells. So we've talked about kind of the big grand scheme of things, and now we're going to start working through each of those systems that we talked about in the very first chapter. So we're going to look at cells, and there's many different types of cells that we're going to see. Maybe you might recognize some of these. Hopefully you recognize this guy here at the bottom. These are your blood cells. All right, so these are your red blood cells down here. You might recognize this guy. This is muscle. All right, here's the muscle cells. So we're going to learn all about the different kinds of cells, and there's many, many different types. So cells in general are the smallest living thing that can exist. So we kind of talked about this in that first chapter, right? So remember, an atom is the smallest unit of an element, just like, right, we said 12 inches to a foot, the inch is the small unit there, right? Cell is the smallest living unit that exists. If we break down a cell, we're going to break it down into subcellular parts, and we're going to take a look at those in this chapter. But this is what's really impressive. There are 75 trillion cells in your body. Trillion. That's a lot of cells, right? That's an amazing amount of cells. And each one of these cells are going to have different forms and functions. We can actually break them down into about 300 different classes, but don't panic. I'm not going to show you all 300 of those. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take a look at cell structure. So we're going to learn all about the cell itself and then what's located inside the cell. All right, so let's go ahead and start taking a look there at what's in the cell. So cells in general are small, right? You can't really see them with the naked eye. We need a microscope to see them. They're very tiny. And they tend to be pretty complex. And inside they have specialized parts that make them go. Just like a robot has specialized parts to make it go. However, there are 3 common parts in all cells. And we're going to take a look at these first. First is the plasma membrane, right? Then we're going to look at the cytoplasm. And then we're going to look at the nucleus. So these are 3 things that we can find in all cells, right? Even though we learned that there are 300 different types, 75 trillion cells, they're all 3 going to have this in common. There might be different parts on the inside. This part they're going to have in common. Right, so some structures may or may not be present. It just depends on the cell type. So as you saw in that first picture, a muscle cell does not look like a blood cell, right? So, and that's because they have different functions. Okay, so what's inside that cell might be different. Ooh, I doubled the slides. Let's move on. All right, so here's a generic cell. So what we're going to do in this chapter is we're going to define each and every one of these parts. So we're going to come back to this, right? And this is going to be really important. So what I'm going to post up for you guys to do as part of one of your exercise is a blank cell. And I do want you to be able to identify all of these parts. Because this is what makes the machine go, right? And a whole bunch of cells all together is what makes you go. So that's pretty important. So let's take a look first at the plasma membrane, right? Remember, they all have the plasma membrane in common. So the plasma membrane is the outer boundary of the cell. It's like the fence around your house, right? It's the outside. It's containing everything. So if we go back to that picture, right, let's see, do they have it labeled? No, but this is the oh, they do. There's the plasma membrane, right? So this whole structure here, right? This whole sac, essentially, that the cell is in, that is your plasma membrane. So it's going to maintain the integrity of the cell, meaning it's going to keep it together. And this is going to be a barrier. This is going to be really important because the plasma membrane is going to keep out bad stuff from the cell or let good stuff in, right? So that's a pretty important barrier. Just like the door to your house, right? You can let certain things in and out of your house. It's composed of 2 different things, right? So each cell, each plasma membrane, we're going to see has 2 layers of phospholipids, right? We talked about those in chapter 2 if you need a refresher, and a layer of cholesterol. So kind of here's what it looks like. So here we've got a zoom in of the whole, so this whole thing is the plasma membrane. So we learned that there's a couple different parts. We've got our 2 layers of phospholipids. So you notice it says phospholipid bilayer. Bi means 2, right? So you can see here we've got 1 layer, all right? And then here we've got the other layer, right? So you can see that they're kind of touching each other, right? And then, let's see, we've got the cholesterols, right, as you can see here, that are in between, okay? And we're going to learn about these. These are important, right? This is what's going to help let things go in or out of the cell. So the proteins are attached to the plasma membrane, okay? So if we go back, right, we've got different proteins, right, as you can see here, that are attached to that plasma membrane. And that plasma membrane, right, is really important. If you don't have that plasma membrane, the cell's going to die, right, because all the insides are going to be spilled out. It's like if you were to try walking around without your skin on, right, everything would spill out. So it's going to be important because it allows transport across the plasma membrane, so it lets things in the cell or out of the cell, so that's kind of important. We're going to have receptors there, right, that are going to help, and enzymes. Remember, we learned that enzymes are kind of like the lock on your door. You got to have the right key to get in. And we're going to see that it also has some identification markers, right, to help let items know where they're going to go in and out of the cell. Now, what's really impressive is the plasma membrane is selectively permeable, meaning it doesn't just allow everything in, right? It's only going to allow certain things inside the cell. So it's not going to just let all the good and all the bad in. It's only going to let certain things. So what's going to be able to pass through that cell membrane is going to be determined by these 4 things, right? How big the molecule is it soluble? Okay, the solubility of it. What about the electrical charge? And what it's carrying. So we're going to see that all of this is pretty important. All right, we're going to stop here, and we'll move on to the next video, taking a look at the next part.